Hey crew, before we get started today, I wanted to make a few announcements. As you know, the prime directive of podcasting is don't send your listeners to another podcast. But I'm going to break that prime directive, and I'll take my chances. I had the occasion to meet up recently with Adam Pranica and Ben Harrison of the Greatest Generation podcast, which you can find at gach.biz. You know how to spell that. They're currently taking their podcast on the road through the northeast of this great land of ours, and there are still tickets available. I'll warn you, some of the shows are sold out, so if you want tickets to their great show, you need to get it right now. To do that, you can go to bit.ly/GG Tour 2017. Again, that's bit.ly/GG TOUR 2017 to get tickets for their Premature Assimilation Tour. If you like that joke, you're going to like their show. It's a very funny show, and they are great guys. A good show. Adult show. A little more adult than this show, but a great show nonetheless. So again, if you want to get tickets to the Greatest Generation Premature Assimilation Tour, it's at bit.ly/GG Tour 2017. And I will actually have audio from the interview with me and Adam and Ben up on our next show, next week, our supplemental show. So look out for that. Also, of course, our live show from Convergence 2017 is available on our Patreon. If you go to patreon.com/EISTpod, you can sign up to contribute to our show for as little as $1. You get access to our live show. Also, you get access to my Klingon Christmas Carol diaries. Diaries is probably too intimate a term, but it is a production diary of me being the director of the Klingon Christmas Carol production at the Mounds Theater in St. Paul this Christmas. And you get access to my audio mini-shows featuring DS9 recaps. That's right, I'm going back and I'm watching the entire series of DS9 from beginning to end, from Emissary to What We Leave Behind. It's going to take a while, but I hope to have a little fun. It's going to be mostly me and possibly some guests, so you get access to that, to the production diary, and of course to our live show and future live shows if you are a member of our Patreon at patreon.com/EISTpod. And one more announcement before we begin our mission. Enterprising Individuals is, of course, a member of the Just Enough Trope Network, and there is a new show I want you to know about on the Just Enough Trope Network. It's called Craft Disservices. It is a quote-unquote bad movie podcast where we look at the movies that critics rejected but audiences embraced. Here's a great example. Teen Wolf. Not a great movie, but a movie you remember, right? You watched it growing up. Everybody knows Teen Wolf, urban surfing, the whole deal. And guess what? It's only like 46% on Rotten Tomatoes. How is that possible? How can a movie that we all remember, and if it was on TV, you'd watch it, be so poorly rated by critics? That's what we talk about on Craft Disservices. Every week, I and a rotating panel of movie experts talk about some of the best movies, the best worst movies of our pasts, what it is we love about them, and why it is the critics said no thank you. Our first show is already up. It features Punisher Warzone, which is a great example of a film like that. We have future shows featuring movies like Willow, the aforementioned Teen Wolf, and sometimes we do actually bad movies like Ballistic X vs. Sever, which is 0% on Rotten Tomatoes, is famously probably the worst reviewed movie of all time. 116 people said no thank you. So if you like movie talk and some of that aforementioned adult humor, tune in to Craft Disservices. You can find it at Craft Disservices, 2 S's in Disservices, at least in the middle, .com. You can also find us at Craft Disservices on Facebook, at Craft Disservice, no S, on Twitter, and on iTunes or Stitcher, Google Play. Search for Craft Disservices. Check that out and keep it real. And with that, let's get underway.
It's worked so far, but we're not out yet.
I want to know what you're thinking. There are some things you can't hide. I want to know what you're feeling. Tell me what's on your mind.
Pure energy.
Hailing frequencies open, and welcome to Enterprising Individuals, the Star Trek discussion podcast that boldly goes into excruciating detail about the series, characters, and stories of the Star Trek universe. I'm your host, Caliban, and I don't always order an increase to Warp 6, but when I do, I expect to hear, "Aye, sir, full impulse." I'm joined on this episode by Marc Giller, author of the futuristic thrillers Hammerjack and also Prodigal. He also wrote the novella Revenant for the Seven Deadly Sins Trek anthology. Marc, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Glad to have you. Permission to come aboard granted. Today we'll be talking about Conspiracy, the 24th episode of the first season of Star Trek The Next Generation, which features Picard and the Enterprise racing to stop a takeover of the Federation. It's a companion piece of sorts to the earlier first season episode Coming of Age, in which Admiral Quinn has Lieutenant Commander Remick investigate the Enterprise. And space bugs were behind it all? We talk often on this show about how, especially in Trek's early seasons, the show was still finding its way and still experimenting, and sometimes that experimentation led the show down some curious paths and to curious choices. There were some stories that may have been sci-fi, but they weren't Trek, and that's something we'll discuss over the course of this show. But first, your backstory. How did you become a Star Trek fan?
Well, I'd been into Star Trek for a very, very long time. Came to it through the original series reruns, which I used to run on our local WTOG Channel 44 station every day at 5 o'clock.
Sure.
And I just got so into the show, even though it was only 3 seasons worth of them. I just kept watching them over and over and over and over again. And not exactly sure what fascinated me so much about it, but there was just something about it that spoke to me. So it just was a really, really big part of my life for a very long time. And back when I was in high school, I was kind of dabbling around with wanting to be a writer. Of course, the first thing that came to mind was, hey, why don't I write a Star Trek novel? So I ended up spending the summer, since I was, pretty uncool and extremely dateless before my senior year, working on a Star Trek novel, which I called Flying Dutchman. It was a mess. Absolutely no doubt about that. But it was a real blast to write, and I managed to get it done in 3 months before school started. And I just, had this manuscript, and it was just in front of me. It was Star Trek and all the things that I'd ever wanted to do. And, I was just amazingly proud of myself, even though it was an extremely bad piece of work. But that was a thing that really got me started in writing. So I'll always be forever grateful to Star Trek for that.
Back in the early days of TNG, the show accepted spec scripts from writers who weren't on the staff. Can you talk about your experiences pitching to the show?
Yeah, absolutely. By that time, that was after I'd gotten through college. I'd graduated shortly before this all happened. I came across an article in the old magazine Cinefantastique,
sure.
Which was basically detailing how Ronald Moore came to write for Star Trek. He was a spec writer living out in L.A. He hadn't really had all that much professional experience, actually, and none whatsoever. And he had submitted a couple of stories to them through their open submissions policy, and I had absolutely no idea that you could do such a thing. And as soon as I heard about that, I said, well, shoot, heck, I can go ahead and do that. So I went ahead and banged out a couple of spec scripts. One of them was an action-adventure type thing in the mold of Die Hard, which absolutely stood zero chance of being made. But I was a real action-adventure kind of guy, and I kind of had to get that off my chest.
Right.
But as soon as I finished that, though, I took a look at the types of stories that they said that they wanted and the types of stories that I'd seen on Star Trek at that point. And that was kind of getting up into pretty much where the third season had ended. And they really seemed to have a big affinity for ship shows and things that were more character-oriented.
Right.
And, obviously, with budgetary concerns and everything, I know this kind of, something that we're definitely looking for. So I wanted to go ahead and do something that was more character-oriented. Right. So I came up with this idea that I called Hallowed Ground, which dealt with the character of Jack Crusher, whom we'd never seen before. Now, I'd always really been fascinated with the relationship between Captain Picard and Beverly Crusher as well, too. And it was one of those things that I felt that the series didn't play with nearly enough.
Yeah.
So it was all centered around the planet where Jack Crusher had been killed years before. And the Enterprise gets some indications that maybe he isn't actually dead and he's still alive and he's still marooned there. And it's the whole process of going through and finding out what really happened to him. So I sent that off to the show, and I didn't think too much about it. But a few months passed by, and then I'm at home one day, and the telephone rings, and I pick it up and said, "Hi, this is Lolita Jack Fascio from the Star Trek Next Generation. Is this Marc Giller?" And I'm like, "Yeah." "Hi, how are you doing?" So they said that they really liked the storyline, and they thought that it was a pretty good fit in terms of the type of style that they were looking for in Star Trek, although they were not buying that particular story for some reason. I think they mentioned is that they really didn't want to fill in the Crusher backstory too much, because I think they probably wanted to leave some room to play with that in the future if they wanted to. So he said, "Do you have any other stories to pitch?" And I said, "Yeah, sure. I'll come up with a few things. Can I come fly out there and see you guys in a couple of weeks?" And they said, "Yeah, sure." So I got on a plane and I flew out to the Paramount lot and sat in the writer's room and pitched stories at them, and probably had the worst case of anxiety attack I've ever had in my entire life. But it was a pretty fascinating experience. Because when I flew out there, it was right after the third season when Michael Piller was running the show. So, yeah, he was actually the first person I met when I went out to the Hart Building on the Paramount lots and introduced myself and said, "Hi, I'm Marc Giller." "Oh, you're Michael Piller. Hey, we rhyme." The guy never even cracked a smile. As I recall, he was the most serious-minded person I think I had ever seen, ever met in my entire life. But Ron Moore was there as well, too, and I met him and shook his hand. And I think Joe Minoski was there as well, too, and Jerry Taylor was in the room as well, too. So it was definitely some good creme de la creme writing talent that I met with that day.
Let's talk a little about your novel, Hammerjack. Would you describe it as a cyberpunk novel?
Yeah, absolutely. I really enjoyed cyberpunk novels of like Neil Stephenson, William Gibson in particular, and kind of wanted to do something like that myself. And this was about, I guess, around 12, 13 years ago when I was pitching that around. And I found a really good literary agent out in Los Angeles, or sorry, not San Francisco, who was looking to break into science fiction because she'd mostly been mysteries and things like that. So she decided to go ahead and take that on, and ended up getting me 2 offers, believe it or not. Because it was actually the 9th novel that I had written. All the rest of them hadn't come anywhere really near even really being published. And she actually managed to get me a couple of offers. Ace coughed up an offer, but ultimately we went with Bantam Spectra. And they were kind of looking to revive cyberpunk because as a genre, it had kind of fallen by the wayside, and there really hadn't been all that many books in that particular genre. And it was, yeah, definitely cyberpunky. Probably not quite as long-haired as the William Gibson stuff because, again, I still have a big affinity for action, adventure, and whatnot. So it was primarily done as a science fiction thriller, but it had the cyberpunk tropes and whatnot. So, yeah, but it's primarily science fiction, action, thriller type stuff. So it was a blast to write.
Yeah, I've always enjoyed cyberpunk as a genre myself, and I always wondered why it had to go away. Sure, it's very closely tied to the culture of the 80s, but it's not like Bruce Sterling came out and said, "We're done, no more." Like, I'm glad that people like you are still writing in that genre because I really do like it a lot.
Yeah, it probably helps that I'm stuck in the 80s, though. That was the decade I grew up in. And, of course, we're talking about Star Trek: The Next Generation. So
yes.
No surprise.
Yes, of course. So why did you pick this episode to talk about today?
Well, it kind of speaks to all the things that I like in not necessarily just science fiction, but in fiction generally. The Star Trek story that I wrote for Seven Deadly Sins was when I pitched that, I basically pitched that as a horror story set in the Star Trek universe, and I think that conspiracy shares a lot of those elements in it as well too. The whole mood of the episode is incredibly tense. The minute you turn that on, if you've never seen Star Trek: The Next Generation before and you got your impressions of what the show was all about based on that episode, you'd be completely blown away and think, "Oh my gosh, this is just kind of spies and aliens and just this really feeling of dread." And it was just for that reason, it was just such an atypical episode, particularly after they've been fumbling around in the first season, trying to get the footing underneath them and trying to figure out what they were. And part of me as the series went on was always kind of hoping that maybe they would start going in more of that conspiracy-esque type direction with the rest of the series, which unfortunately they didn't do. But it was just this wonderfully creepy atmosphere, a wonderfully tense episode. It just builds with just this ominous sense of dread throughout the entire episode until you get to this really, literally explosive climax. And it just blew me away because I had never seen anything like that in Next Generation or any other Star Trek incarnation before either. So I just always enjoyed that episode for that reason, because it was just so atypical and so gripping and so visceral. Yeah,
it's certainly unique in the canon, I think.
Absolutely. It's it's provokes a lot of strong feelings too. In years since when I've read about what people think of that episode, I think people either love it or they absolutely detest it. And I just haven't fallen to that former camp. But I've met a lot of people who just didn't care for it all that much. I mean, I heard that, Roddenberry was not a big fan of that particular episode either.
Right.
Yeah, because he always had this utopian ideal of what the Federation and what Starfleet were like and whatnot. And, I always thought that was just, so much BS because, it's just like it's a military outfit. You're going to have some bad apples in the bunch. people are still people. Human beings won't be evolving beyond, pettiness and greed and ambition just because it's 300, 400 years in the future. And so I've read a lot of the writers kind of butted heads with Roddenberry over the years as a recent because of that as well too.
Well, we'll definitely be talking about that a little later as well. But first of all, I wanted to say it is the episode Conspiracy. It's the 24th episode of the first season. It first aired on May 9th, 1988. The teleplay was by Tracy Torme, who's a writer and executive story editor on the show's first and second seasons. He's the son of Mel Torme. He was the creator of Sliders, and we're going to talk about him a lot more in just a bit. The story was from Robert Sabaroff. He's a television writer who wrote the original series episode The Immunity Syndrome. He also co-created the contemporary of that time NBC series Then Came Bronson. And it was directed by Cliff Bole, who directed many episodes of Next Gen, DS9, and Voyager, and the Bolian race, which appears for the first time in this episode, is named for him. The start date on this episode is given as 41775.5, and your assignment is, if you can, to give us a 25-word synopsis of Conspiracy.
Okay, well, let's see. Let's look this up on the Wikipedia page. No, it's basically... I studied this episode pretty carefully because the one Star Trek Next Generation novel that I did write called Stormfront, which was unpublished, that was actually one that worked its way all the way up to the top over at Pocket Books as well, too, before it was ultimately turned down. But it did weave in a lot of elements of this particular episode, including Captain Ricks, who plays a pretty prominent role in there, because I thought it was just such a badass thing having the guy from The Hills Have Eyes in the Star Trek episode.
Right, yeah, right.
But basically, the long story short is that Walker Keel, an old friend of Jean-Luc Picard, sends him a mysterious message asking to meet on a remote planet called Ditalix B. And the two of them meet down there along with a couple of other Starfleet personnel, including another captain and Captain Ricks. And Keel intimates to Picard about very unusual activity that he's noticed within Starfleet. People getting shuffled around and commands being moved around and kind of like it seems like pieces being moved around a chessboard. And he thinks that there's some kind of a conspiracy going on within Starfleet, and he has absolutely no idea what's going on with it. So what are we to do? And of course, Picard has his doubts because he's a Roddenberry man, so he thinks the Federation, we don't have people like that, trying to pull the strings behind the scenes. But then Keel's ship is blown up, and all of a sudden it seems like, wow, there's something to this. So Picard and the Enterprise go back to Earth to talk to the Starfleet about it, and all the rest.
Yep, that's a pretty good pitch, I think, for the episode too. I would want to watch that. Some interesting facts from the memory banks for this episode. Captain Ricks, of course, is played by Michael Berryman, who, as you mentioned, is from The Hills Have Eyes and other things, plenty of other things. He's done so much genre work. He's so distinctive looking. I'm surprised that he didn't make any more appearances in any Trek shows.
Actually, I did read he did appear in, what was it, Star Trek 4?
Star Trek 4, right.
Yeah, very, very brief role in that. But I was actually very, very disappointed that they didn't bring back Captain Ricks in any subsequent episodes because it's such an interesting guy, very, very intense. And
yes, absolutely. Yeah,
that was one of the reasons I wanted to use him as a character in my Stormfront novel because it was just, literally he could walk into a scene and steal it by just standing there.
Also, the Paramount prop department, never one to waste materials, redressed Admiral Jameson's wheelchair from the episode Too Short a Season to serve as Remmick's chair in this episode. And the desk in Admiral Quinn's guest quarters would serve as Benjamin Sisko's desk when he was at Starfleet headquarters in DS9's fourth season.
Well, never let it be said that let anything go to waste.
No, and they're never ones to waste footage either. The exterior shots of Starfleet headquarters come from Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home. And so as such, two Tellarites appear in the background, marking the only appearance of the Tellarites on Next Generation.
Well, that is some pretty inside baseball stuff right there.
Yeah, I'm so sad because the Tellarites are, all right, maybe not a well-developed race, but they're kind of forgotten. Like, they used to be founders of the Federation. I think they've kind of retconned that. And so I'm hoping to see them in Discovery, like, learn a little more about them.
Yeah, it should be interesting.
They're the pig-faced guys. This is the first episode to show Earth and our moon in The Next Generation. This episode won an Emmy Award for Outstanding Achievement in Makeup for a Series. The parasites, of course, in this episode were designed by series designer Andrew Probert. They never again appear on screen, but author S.D. Perry has brought them back in some novels. She actually connects them to Trill symbionts, and they're actually at war with the Trill in the novels. And then in Unjoined, the authors of Unjoined reveal that the parasites are genetically modified Trill. It's very sensational, so they do come back in the extended media. In some spin-off media, they're referred to as bluegills because Riker clearly uses the term bluegill at the end of the episode, although it's unknown if he was referring to the species as a whole or just the literal bluegill that comes out of the back of people's neck.
Out of the back of their necks.
Right, yeah. And I saw a fun chat on the Memory Alpha article talk page about that.
Yeah, it is pretty interesting. Of course, it would make it a little difficult for people with short hair to hide the fact that they've been infected. So maybe that was one little overlook that they had in that concept. But yeah,
that's true.
They were thoroughly disgusting, though. And when I saw them crawling into Remek's mouth, and then when they phasered him,
yes.
And they exploded, and you had this big mother creature in there. Definitely shades of Alien there for sure. But it was delightfully disgusting, and I was really surprised that. They were allowed to get away with that level of violence at that time in Star Trek: Next Generation.
I know it's so. That's what I want to talk about. I mean, it's so different than what you'd usually get on Star Trek. And speaking of the violence, the episode was censored in the United Kingdom and Canada for its content when it plays. But I wanted to talk about Tracy Torme, and there's a funny story. Well, it's not that funny about how this episode sort of came about. In that, I guess he as a writer and. You may be familiar with this. He was different than the other writers. He had some kind of personal relationship with Gene Roddenberry. He was not really on staff in the same way. He didn't have to go in and help break stories. He wasn't in the writer's room. All he had to do was just deliver like 3 scripts a year, and he could go off and do his own thing.
Yeah, and as such, I think that means he was able to tell Maurice Hurley to kiss his butt.
Yeah, or at least he tried to. Yeah, several times, And so he developed this script, and supposedly, initially it was just going to be a flat-out conspiracy, like a military coup. People inside Starfleet wanted to take over Starfleet, and as you had pointed out, that we knew what happened. Gene balked at that idea. He did not want that idea because he thought that we all get along in the 21st century.
So that's not Starfleet. Starfleet would never ever be that way. So
right, and so right, and they had already kind of set this up with Coming of Age that something was going on. But my question is, like, why they saved it by making it space bugs? Like that's how they saved that idea.
Absolutely, because it kind of seems like a perfect out as far as Roddenberry is concerned. He hated the idea, but he liked Tracy Torme, so obviously he didn't want to reject the episode outright. So we just come up with, and actually I believe it was Maurice Hurley who did come up with that idea. To change it to alien bug things, so that instead of it being some cabal of Starfleet officers operating in the background and trying to take over, they didn't know what they were doing, so it was the aliens that did it. Yeah, that's the ticket. So it falls on the responsibility of having to say that there are bad elements within Starfleet. And I did think that probably out of all the things, that was probably a cop out in a lot of ways. I probably would have preferred to have seen it. As Torme's original vision, because that would have set up, just this amazing arc that you could have taken throughout the rest of the series as well too. But again, that was also a no-no. Paramount didn't want to they would want to be able to strip the series in syndication, and they didn't want to have long-running story arcs. Because I remember reading in the 50-year mission, very very interesting book that was just published. Went into great detail about that, about how the writers were always fighting to be able to do bigger stories and bigger arcs and things like that. But Paramount just said, and Rick Berman in particular, when he took over, was like, no, we just can't do it that way. So I think that certainly in Conspiracy that was a lost opportunity. But obviously that was running into some sort of serious headwinds with the way they wanted to structure the series. But it did set up some pretty interesting stuff, and that's one of the reasons I really did like the episodes that Torme penned. He just seemed like he had a pretty unique vision and a pretty unique style for a Star Trek writer.
He really did, and as I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, I think there are ideas that are Trek, and there are ideas that aren't. And I guess if you do something that isn't for long enough, then it will become Trek. But at this early time, they just decided, I don't think that's the way we want to go. And he wrote a lot of original ideas. like the Royale, the one where they go to the fake hotel or whatever, and they have to play craps to be able to escape. I mean, that's a very un-Star Trek kind of show.
Yeah, it was a good thing that he was involved in the series at such an early time when it was really still kind of stumbling around and trying to figure out what it wanted to be.
Right.
Because once by the time Michael Piller had come on board and they'd really kind of set into the formula of what Star Trek: The Next Generation was going to be, I don't think that they would have allowed him to get away with things like that. So I guess we were pretty fortunate that he was around for the first and second seasons. Because as much as people like to criticize the show for just stumbling around and not really knowing what it wanted to be, kind of this feathered fish in space and still trying to figure things out. I still think in those early episodes though you did see probably some of the best creativity they ever had on the show. Because you had some writers like Torme who were just like, hey, what the hell, I'm gonna go for broke here and then see what we can do. And it really does make you wonder what the show might have been like had some of those currents been able to keep going.
True. Although, we get things like Minosky gives us masks in like the 7th season. So
that's the episode that shall not be named.
Yes. And I also
that episode so bad. I'm surprised that Brandon Braga didn't write it.
Whoa! Shots fired.
I pitched to Brandon one time over the phone, and I did not like the man.
Oh, okay, all right. Well, and I also just kind of realized something as well. He created Laxwana Troy, so
another reason that
So clearly he's friends with Gene, right?
Hated
it. He inflicted that person on us. Yeah. Okay. Well, it's all coming together now in my mind. I'm understanding now.
Oh, I know. But he created the character, but I think it was definitely subsequent writers who made her really, really irritating. That was it. Did he write Manhunt?
Yes, he did. Yes, he did.
Okay. Yeah.
And he will burn in hell for that.
That was a fairly funny episode. And again, where they're trying to reach beyond the kind of the standard Star Trek imprint and, turn into something that's a little bit more broad comedy. And I did think that there were definitely some hilarious aspects of that. She's chasing after Picard and he's hiding out in the holodeck. And, of course, right. Opportunity for him to, be Dixon Hill. So there were definitely some good aspects of that. But, yeah, as a whole, Luoxana I could definitely do without.
That's the one that Mick Fleetwood is in.
Yes. Steals the show. Never says a word.
Right, yeah. as the fish guy. Well, when I think about this episode, which I watched, as a kid when it was originally on, I guess my first reaction is, a guy's head blows up. I remember seeing this as a kid, and I was like, whoa. I mean, it is very dynamic, but it's hard to know what they're thinking. I mean, you mentioned Hurley coming up with the idea for the alien bugs or whatever. I know they were trying to fix the script after Gene balked at that coup angle, but how did they end up at head pinata filled with meat spiders? Like, how did they even get there?
You know what? I mean, maybe at that point, I don't exactly know what was going through Tracy Torme's mind at the time, or whether he got rewritten or whether he rewrote it himself.
Maybe he was imagining Maurice Hurley's head.
Given what he was trying to do, I could kind of picture him just saying, oh, well, they're going to mess up with my script. All right, I'm going to see what I can get away with here.
Sure. Okay. That's a good point.
Enough, they let him get away with that. I know. It's when I was writing Revenant, it was Marco Palmieri, the editor over at Star Trek at the time, who brought me on to do that. He'd read my cyberpunk novels and thought that I'd be a good fit to do a Borg story, since there's definitely some real cyberpunky elements involved in that. And when I pitched that to him as a horror story and kind of told him what I wanted to do, he didn't balk at that at the least. And I was very surprised at that as well, too, because that is a hyper-violent story. And the whole idea was to, kind of take the Borg, who had been sort of neutered, throughout the Voyager years, and just, turn them into badasses again. And
sure.
I thought the best way of doing that was just to, pen an extremely violent story. And surprise, I mean, Pocket let me get away with it. So I guess I did the same thing with this episode back at Paramount back in those days.
Yeah. The parasites themselves are strange. They're weird. They are kind of gross at times. And the effects are stop motion, which I really like stop motion, but it's not done all that well here. Plus, they're practical effects. They're in camera, so they can't be remastered for the Blu-rays. So in fact, they look even worse in the Blu-rays because there's more detail. They just don't really come off all that well, sadly.
Yeah, I know. You kind of wonder if they could actually reconstruct the scene and then do it digitally by just completely redoing it.
Oh boy, yeah.
That would be pretty interesting.
It'd probably be really
I would
expensive.
love to see that as well too. With the original series episodes, with the remastered digital editions and the computer-generated special effects and whatnot, are just wonderful and give it a whole new lease on life. Be interesting to see them do that with some of the next gen stuff too.
This episode introduces a lot of sort of ancillary characters, none of whom ever really come back, which is too bad because they're kind of interesting. Of course, Robert Schenken comes back as Dexter Remick, and Ward Costello is back again as Admiral Quinn.
I know, Remick's a paper pusher. Who would figure he'd be the big bad, right?
Yeah, that is kind of a fun twist. The problem, I think, with the episode is that the other bad guys, the other villains, aren't really villains at all. Like they're just not much of a threat. They're just it's cool when Admiral Quinn starts ragdolling people around, but the other admirals are just standing around looking kind of tired.
Yeah, I know. Maybe we could have probably done with less is more in this episode. Maybe concentrating the thread on just a couple of characters, particularly if we'd maybe focus more on Quinn since we'd met him in the previous episode,
right?
And Remick as well too. But
yeah.
Obviously it's conspiracy, so you can't have a conspiracy of just one.
Of one.
You have to have
right.
a number of different people. So I suppose that they didn't have too much choice in going in that direction. It's just kind of too bad that we weren't able to kind of serialize that over more previous episodes to kind of get a more of a feel for that organization and those people. But that's a constraint of the show, so what can you do?
Yeah, that's not what they were doing then. But you've got Vice Admiral Aaron, and he's kind of the Mike Pence-looking guy. And you've got the Vulcan guy, Savar, who is not a very good Vulcan. Like, he speaks of delight, and he seems to have emotions, and he can't even do the Vulcan neck pinch right. He grabs Riker, and Riker's just like, ah! It's like, that's not really what happens. He's supposed to fall down.
Well, it was the alien inside of him. I guess he didn't exactly know how to do the neck pinch, so he did the best that he could with it.
Yeah, that's the headcanon there. Yeah, sure.
I know, but a Vulcan admiral, though, is like kind of an interesting concept.
Yeah, it is. It is. Yeah, I think so too. Admiral Quinn. He must beat up half the main cast in this episode, and he throws Riker through a glass coffee table, which has got to be one of the worst jobs in the 24th century. A glass coffee table insurance investigator.
Yeah.
A lot of those things get broken.
It would have been safety glass or something. Good grief.
Right. Yeah. Right. Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Transparent aluminum. Have a transparent aluminum table.
Yeah, exactly, and the Rear Admiral Savar does mention, I guess, in speaking of the creature's motivations once it's revealed to Picard, that they relish the theater of what they're doing. Like they kind of like templing their fingers, and and I think that is a good line. It's also a line by Torme that excuses whatever else comes after that. It's cheesy, but it works, and it really does work. I remember freaking out as a kid because I thought, when Riker walks in and stops Picard, I thought, oh crap, Riker's taken over. This is it. This is the end of the show. We're at the end of the thing anyway, the season. And now as an adult, I'm thinking, why does Riker have to get all the way in there? He play acts the whole thing. He's got his gullet open, ready to catch some worms that he's dropping in there. And then he pulls and starts shooting. I mean, let's wring every second out of this. You think the parasites enjoy their drama? You haven't met Will Riker.
Oh, I know. You figured that, obviously if they could beam down, they could beam up. So, probably the most expeditious thing would have been just to go ahead and beam everybody up and keep them in stasis to figure out what they wanted to do with it. But
exactly, yeah.
Yeah, but again, I was just like, if you think too hard about it, then it's like, no, it's definitely, let's go ahead and do that.
I'm going down there. Yeah, right.
But obviously, the aliens have a sense of humor as well too. When Quinn's grabbing Riker and crushing his arm, it's like vitamins do the body good.
Yeah, right.
That was a nice little throwaway line right there.
Yeah. I guess the practical explanation for the Riker thing would be that he needs the bad guy's hands full of worms so he can get some unanswered shots off. You came pretty close to eating some worms there, buddy. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, I still don't understand. They're inhabiting a human host though, and you figure they still want to eat cheeseburger and fries and whatnot. I don't know where the worm thing comes in, but that's probably one of those things that Torme thought, oh, that's disgusting. I'll see that they'll never let me get away with this. I'll just put it in there and see what happens.
Yeah, it's part of those kind of creepy crawly elements that Torme is kind of sticking into this thing. And
yeah, and that's when the show goes from being this political thriller over to straight horror, which again is something that you see very, very little of in Star Trek: The Next Generation as well too. I think the only other time that they came even close to a mood like that, which is another episode that a lot of people hate, was Night Terrors. Remember that one?
Yes, I do. One Moon, yeah.
Oh, yeah. And again, that was an episode I really liked because I thought that the mood of it was absolutely fantastic and, had a very, very good sense of dread building throughout that whole thing. And I don't know. Again, it's another one of those reasons I don't know why people don't like that particular episode. Again, maybe it's because it's so atypical, because it's so kind of straight up more of a horror show. I mean, the original series episodes like Wolf in the Fold, I loved those because it was like whenever that came on, it was like an extra Halloween for me when I was a kid, and I absolutely loved.
Oh, sure.
Those. So the kind of the scarier stories were ones that always appealed to me, and I guess it's kind of why I decided to take that approach when I finally got a chance to publish a Star Trek story of my own.
Yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned that thing about Torme trying to get away with something, because you're right. It does. His original concept is political thriller, and then he goes straight over into a horror, Grand Guignol kind of horror. So I like to think that he was at his typewriter going, "Ooh, now I'm going to do this," and then that guy's head's going to explode. And
yeah, he was just hacked because his original story got changed.
Sure, right. I was thinking about why isn't this over the second Troy gets within range of these guys? She should be able to telepathically tell that they are planning something.
Yeah, I would think so, unless, she is an empath, so she senses emotions,
True. Yeah.
Not really actual thoughts. So maybe the aliens have a great way of concealing that, and they don't provoke an emotional response in the people that they take over.
Plus, yeah, exactly. Yeah, like if they're puppeting these victims and there's nothing to sense from the victim, maybe.
Yeah, exactly. They really seem to be having a good time, so that's a
yeah, right.
That maybe just kind of throws everybody off. You go, oh well, alien conspiracy. They're going to be very serious-minded and full of gusto and tension and everything. It's like no, we're just having the time of our lives here.
Right. Yeah, I sense that they're very happy and they love worms, Captain. Is there a scene, moment, or character that really stands out for you in this show?
I loved the interplay between Walker Keel and Jean-Luc Picard in there, because you could definitely, obviously there was a lot of history between the two men, and which remained largely unexplored. And again, throwing Beverly Crusher obviously knew him as well too, because they all knew each other when Jack was still alive. Right. That was probably the thing that I liked the most in terms of character interplay, because again, I was a big fan of teasing the relationship between Crusher and Picard, and again, that was another one of those things that I really wish that they'd done more with during the course of the series, because I did think that Crusher was an interesting character, woefully underused, and I think that they probably should have done more with her, and especially particularly her relationship with Picard as the series went on. So seeing any little bits and pieces like that pop up in the series during the course of its run were ones that I liked, because that was something I really wanted to see more of.
Yeah, they really seem to push, especially in the early seasons, that connection. Picard would always run into a buddy or somebody that knew Jack Crusher or knew Beverly. And, it would have been interesting to see that developed a little more.
You think about just the way he felt about it, too. Obviously he cares about the woman, but he was very, very good friends with her husband who had died. And, that kind of sense of torn loyalties and whatnot would have been, they played on it a little bit, they introduced it, but, then they just seemed to largely drop it. And, by the time around season 4 or season 5 came along, they just didn't do anything with it at all. And then, of course, at the very end of the series, they spoke to it, and they'd gotten married and then gotten divorced and whatnot.
Right. Yeah.
It's just like, what? What? Now you're going to do this to me? Give me a break.
Yeah. I really like, I mentioned this before, like, the guy's head blows up, but I also like...
his head blew up.
Well,
you had nightmares about that, didn't you?
Yeah, I think I did. How weird Remick is, and then they have the thing where he stands up and his neck is sort of bulging, and he says, "We seek peaceful coexistence." I got to tell you, guy, you're going to get phasered down. That's what's going to happen.
I'm telling you, though, that the aliens have a hell of a sense of humor. I mean,
they do.
That was him he was laying it all out there on the line and having a good old chuckle, even when he was phasered.
I know. Maybe he thought, the jig's up. At least I'm going to get a good line here going out.
Oh, I know. It's just like, I definitely find them a lot more interesting than the Trill.
Yeah, for sure. There's a lot of things that in this episode that are funny, either intentionally or non-intentionally. We usually talk about our favorite jokes or comedy bits from the episode, but I wanted to talk about the literal joke in this episode. They do one of those things, which along with, I think, souffle humor and a wino seeing something unbelievable and then like looking at his bottle and dumping it out, you don't really see a lot of things, any bits on TV anymore where somebody's like finishing a joke and then everybody's like, and we don't hear what the joke is. I mean, they've done this a few times on the show. Is it ever funny when they do that? I mean, I've tried to backform jokes from these punchlines that they give, like the Ferengi and the clown suit bit, and I can never think of anything that would be funny about these jokes.
Oh, I never thought there was anything particularly funny about the Ferengi period. Thank you for bringing that up. I'd actually largely forgotten about that.
Yeah.
But well, Star Trek and humor, back in the original series when they actually started doing some of those more broad comedy episodes, which began with the trouble with Tribbles, and they realized, wow, these characters can actually be funny. They did the comedy pretty well there, because I think the character relationships that lent themselves better to that. Next Generation, though, was always a heck of a lot more stiff. So I think anytime they tried to get these very, very dignified characters to kind of go off and do something funny, it often just came off as being very, very flat, or just kind of kind of stupid or unfunny. It's like you're trying too hard. So
yeah.
I don't think that they did that very well on Next Generation at all, really. I mean, you got a couple of bright spots here and there, like I said. I mean, there were a couple of good things from Manhunt, and I think that kind of speaks well to Tracy Torme and his versatility as a writer. But writers on Next Generation, I don't think were very funny at all. Anytime they tried to do something broadly comedic, like any Risa episodes, it just fell flat on its face.
Yeah, I think that you're right. I think that's the downside of Gene's vision, is that these, like you said, very distinguished characters can't let it all hang out sometimes. But sometimes we get Cupid.
Yeah, Cupid was a good episode. Captain's Holiday was a pretty good episode as well, too. That played, and even had a Ferengi in it. I was really amazed. I actually enjoyed that episode.
That's right.
But I think that those are probably the exceptions that prove the rule.
Right. I like how they're still playing with Data's characterization here. Later, I mean, him trying to be human and all that, that's going to continue throughout the series, but the way that he pursues that is interesting. And they have a little side scene that I think in any other case would be cut from a show, where he's like talking to the computer and he's reading things, and he realizes that he's sort of talking to himself, and he gets really excited about the fact that that's a really human thing to do. I just thought that was a little character moment that might have got lost in a later season episode.
Oh, yeah. I'm absolutely certain that probably wasn't written into there as well, too. That was all Brent Spiner, because I do know that I read during the course of the series, I mean, he was always trying to mine certain little nuggets out of there. He's very, very, very good character actor, and, by that point, I mean, early on in the series, it's pretty amazing that he had that much of a knowledge of the character and what he wanted it to be. So you definitely have to give him credit for that.
Sure. So let me ask you, as somebody who's a fan of this episode and these horror elements, what would your pitch be to make Trek more horror-centered, or to bring more horror in? We've had the Borg before, and of course you've dealt with that in your short story, your novella. But what would you do to try to see those elements be brought in?
I know it's kind of hard to say. I mean, I guess pretty much just what I did when I pitched the story Revenant to Pocket was, I approached that from the standpoint of, it was just ancillary characters from the Star Trek universe. There was only Nick Locarno was really the only established character that
okay.
The universe.
Yeah.
Story. So it was kind of nice. I was able to go in there and bend my own characters, and then I could do whatever I wanted to them. I didn't have to worry about series continuity or anything like that. So,
sure.
I guess really that's probably the only way that you can do that. Sort of go off in sort of like a Rogue One direction, except for Star Trek, where you've got your own set of characters in your own little universe, and that you can play around with, and you can do whatever you want with it. I think that if I were going to be doing certainly a series-oriented Star Trek or something like that. I'd probably go in a direction like that. Maybe you just kind of have a side story with characters that are apart from the main ones who have to survive week to week, and you actually put them into real danger, and then you really don't know what's going to happen to them from episode to episode.
Yeah, I think that body horror might be a good way to go, simply because it's based in biology and science. If you had some characters that were trapped on a ship and they're getting sick and dying one by one, and they have to find a way to stop it, like something like that.
Oh yeah.
The problem is that since it's a TV show, these characters have to come back week after week, and to really do horror, you need to have stakes. And if nobody can die, then the stakes are really low.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and unfortunately, you're kind of trapped with that convention. And that if you have the guest star who shows up and they're going to get killed, I mean,
oh yeah, they're gone.
Everybody knows. Oh yeah, so here it's just another red shirt. We're going to do something really disgusting to them.
Anytime some guys,
it's not really horror. I mean, that's just kind of. To have true horror, you really have to be able to invest in the characters and care about what's going to happen to them, and have a real uncertainty about what's going to happen to them as well, too. But episodic television, being limited that way, it's kind of hard to do. I mean, I guess unless you're The Walking Dead and you can kill off whoever you want.
Right.
Unless it's Trill. So.
Yeah, whenever somebody shows up and he's one of my oldest friends, that guy's gone by the end of the episode.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, you may as well put a red shirt on him.
Yeah, exactly. Well, as we come to the end of the show here, did you have any parting shots or last thoughts about this episode?
It's still, looking at it, even though it's been, probably about 20 years since I'd seen it last. I studied up on it in preparation for the podcast here. It aged really well, and I have to say that is not true of a lot of Next Generation. Which is kind of interesting because I still sit down and I watch the original series remasters with my kids, and they're both teenagers, young teenagers, and my daughter absolutely loves it. And it's and those really bear up well over time. And obviously you've got your occasional clunkers here and there, you're in the children's Harold Mead or Spock's Brain or whatnot, mostly those third season ones. But by and large, I think original Trek holds up very, very well. A lot of Next Generation doesn't. I feel a little differently about Deep Space Nine because I think that they were definitely grittier, and I think it holds up a little bit better. With Star Trek Next Generation, a lot of it does kind of seem sort of 80s era cheesy type stuff. But Conspiracy is one of those episodes I do think that holds up remarkably well. You could put that up there with some of the best of that Star Trek had to offer, along with Yesterday's Enterprise or Best of Both Worlds. Which those are just still amazing to watch even after all of these years. And Conspiracy definitely strikes me as that kind of episode as well too.
Here's a question for you. Do you think that it's Gene's influence that kept cyberpunk out of the development of Next Generation? I mean, it was made in the 80s. I can't believe there isn't somebody jacking into the data nodes or something like that. Do you know what I mean? Computers are almost an afterthought on the show.
Yeah, that is actually kind of an interesting thing that there wasn't more stories about the merging of the human beings and technology. Obviously you had that with the Borg. But in terms of human beings going in that direction, I was really, really surprised about that. But it wouldn't surprise me at all, too, because I know that, certainly from my own experience with the show back in those days and from reading about it pretty extensively since then, that Roddenberry was a very limiting factor on the development of that show. And because of his insistence that everybody be perfect and that there be no internal conflict between the characters. And that human beings had somehow evolved beyond pettiness and jealousy and ambition and everything else. Really, not only, I know that a lot of the writers got extremely frustrated with it because it's like, well, if you don't have conflict, you don't have drama, what the hell are we supposed to do with this? But in terms of, taking it in directions that would have been a lot more interesting, I would say so. And you could definitely see that as well, too. I mean, just look at what the Happy Writers crew over at Deep Space Nine was able to do with that. Once they didn't have so many people peeking over their shoulders, and with Roddenberry out of the picture, and with Rick Berman largely leaving them alone to do their own thing, they accomplished some pretty amazing stuff over there. So,
agreed.
It does make you shake your hand and wonder what might have been. But on the other hand, though, if it hadn't been for Roddenberry and his vision, nobody would have ever been there in the first place. So
that's absolutely true. Yeah. As far as my opinion of the episode, it's fun. I enjoy it. It's fun to specifically kind of look back at it and maybe sometimes shake your head. There's a lot of creativity on display, which is great. And they're appropriating things from like Body Snatchers and Alien, but I think they do it in a kind of Trek way and do it with style. And it's fun to see the characters. Sometimes I can't believe what I'm seeing, but I think the characters can't believe what they're seeing sometimes. Like when that thing comes out of Remick, they both look at each other like, "What show are we on? What is this?" And then they just blast it.
You have to do that. I mean, TV series by their very nature, when they're on for a long time, get stale, and you really have to shake things up. And I think it makes it fun for the actors, fun for the writers, and fun for everybody.
Well, speaking of shows that are going on for a long time, Star Trek is coming back, of course, with Star Trek Discovery this fall. So fingers crossed, we hope. Do you have an opinion? Are you looking forward to Discovery?
Yeah, I haven't actually read too much about it because, Paramount's been pretty tight-lipped about it. You'll hear a few sneaky things here and there. But I have very, very high hopes for it. Big fan of Brian Fuller. I think he's a very talented writer, a good visionary. Loved Hannibal. Just absolutely incredible series. And obviously he's not shy with dealing with the horror elements. So I've got a lot of hope of that's going to turn out to be something pretty special, pretty spectacular.
Let's talk My Space Dad Can Beat Up Your Space Dad. Who's your favorite captain and why?
James T. Kirk. Absolutely. He's timeless. He is timeless. It's just that's the character I grew up with. It's the guy that I was always rooting for when I was a kid, and it's just once you've kind of gone classic Trek, that's your formative experience. I think that you just don't have any choice. It's got to be James Kirk.
Now that we've reached the end of the show, you'll receive a commission and the rank of ensign. What department on the ship do you work in?
I guess you can put me in the computer core. That's what I do for a living.
Sure. They never really show the computer's almost an afterthought on the show. I mean, it does what they ask it to, but you wonder how they work and how you reprogram them, if there's hackers in their universe. Those missing cyberpunk elements that we talked about.
Oh yeah. Those actually the computer cores figure pretty prominently in my unpublished Star Trek Next Gen.
Oh really? Okay, sure.
Yeah, but also in Revenant as well too, because Nick Locarno has become something of a computer hacker. So he uses his skills to take out a starship. So it's pretty fun stuff.
Well, Ensign Giller, thanks for joining me to talk about Star Trek and the Star Trek universe. If people want to continue the conversation, and they can at EISTpod on Twitter and the Enterprising Individuals Facebook page, where can people find you online?
They can find me at hammerjack.net. That's where I do my blogging and various posting, and it's got listing about all of the great stuff that I've written and bad stuff that I have written and everything in between.
Didn't you? A lot of those scripts that you were working up to pitch to Paramount, you've got them up on your site, right?
Yeah. As a matter of fact. So if you want to go back in time and check those out and see Star Trek episodes that never got made, you can do that too.
Well, thanks again for joining me.
My pleasure.
We are signing off until the next mission. Hailing frequencies closed.
It's on your